All right, we're going to get started. So thank you everybody for coming. My name is Dave Fishman. Come on in. It is cold in here. So my name is Dave Fishman. I'm an entrepreneur with Noah. I'm going to be talking about data's disruptive innovation. Before I get into my talk, I just want to say a couple of things. One is I am not talking for 90 minutes. Sorry, that is not happening. So I ask if there are any questions. Let's ask the questions while the slide is up rather than going back to it. Go ahead, Ken. Yeah, I have a whole slide on what an entrepreneur is. Don't you fret. Second thing that I want to say is this is an 80-20 solution, meaning this is what I'm about to describe. I cannot guarantee it's going to occur 100% of the time for 100% of the organizations. This is more of an 80-20 solution. There are absolutely fringe cases that people could come up with that, you know, kind of goes against what I'm saying, which is fine. I'm not saying this is 100%. So my goal is to get everybody to think and say, is this happening in my organization? Okay. So this is, again, not 100%. This is an 80-20. Third is I have links in all the notes of the slides that describe in detail how I got to the end, how the author, got to the end result. And then I took the end result and then I applied it to data's disruptive innovation. I don't have time to go into great details about how we arrived at their conclusion that I'm applying to my work. So if anybody's interested in how that occurred, the links are there. Okay, so please feel free if you're wondering, for example, how abstract math works. There's a whole TED talk on that I have in my notes. Okay, so I budgeted about 2 to 2.5 minutes a slide. So, and then a scenario at the end. So if we really dive deep into some good questions, then we could just skip the scenario at the end. Right? So for those of you that came here thinking that we were going to talk about this data for his disruptive innovation, I'm sorry, we are not talking about Commander data. So if you thought this was a next generation talk, I'm sorry to disappoint you. If you want to leave, please feel free. I totally understand, because that would have been a lot more interesting than what I'm about to talk about. But still, we're not talking about Commander data, okay? We're talking about data, not Commander data. So we got to start with why, okay? So I believe that the data is going to provide a better path forward to some future state that is more comprehensive than the traditional methodologies that we're using today. And I think that this path, this new data path, is going to improve morale. It's going to modernize how we make our decisions. It's going to create a better vision, and it's going to accelerate research to operations. So I think this is a really positive step for us. And that's why my goal here is to get everybody to recognize this. So before I talk about data's disruptive innovation, I want to talk about what is disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation was coined by Clayton Christensen. And basically what Clayton said was, it's an innovation that enters at the bottom of an existing market and eventually displaces the established market leaders. Now, that's what it says verbally. So for those of you like me that are visual, this is what it looks like, okay? You have performance versus time. Yes? Okay, I don't know how to do that on, can you do that? Sorry about that. Okay, perfect, thank you. Okay, So what is disruptive innovation? What does it look like? Okay, so this is what it looks like. You have performance over time. You have your low market products, your middle market, and then your market leader. And then what happens is this disruptive technology starts at the bottom and it works its way up and eventually displaces the market leader. But what's really important here, why it's a disruptive innovation, is that is there any way to get rid of this on top? Minimize that. Let me see if I can get hide video panel. No. Hide floating aid controls. Okay, there we go. These stupid toast pop-ups. Great, thank you very much. So what's important to realize here visually is that the disruptive technology starts at the bottom of the market and it eventually displaces the market leader. But since it starts at the bottom, the market leaders are saying, they're no threat to us because their performance is subpar. It's not very good. We don't see them as a threat. They don't see them as a threat until it's too late because they've already displaced it. Go ahead.
Is the assumption that the sort of inverse version of that is the normal way of things working, that the market leader brings in the innovation and it's not disruptive?
Correct. That is exactly right. Cool. That's exactly right. And so there's lots of innovation that follows the normal market procedures, but there's this disruptive innovation that causes the leading market to be displaced. So here's some examples of a disruptive innovation. Blockbuster was replaced by Netflix. If you remember Netflix, when it first started, you used to have to go in, order a movie, it would be mailed to you, you would watch the movie, and you would mail it back. That was subpar technology because Blockbuster said, well, people could just walk down the street and get a movie and watch it right away, and then return it and get another one. So we don't see them as a threat until that Netflix technology got better and better and better, and eventually overplaced and took Blockbuster away. Another example, yeah, go ahead.
So in a bubble, that makes sense. But what about the recent developments with Netflix, where the traditional players are now overtaking the market?
Yeah, so that's a really good point because Netflix is actually now going through its own disruptive innovation. But that's because of the business model. But you could also argue that Blockbuster's business model also caused the disruptive innovation. So you're correct. And I was hoping that nobody would notice that I picked Netflix because they're also going through their own disruptive innovation, but let's ignore that for now. But yes, you're correct. Exactly. It doesn't happen just once. So the next one I want to talk about is like chemical photography versus digital photography. Those of you that are my age, okay, remember when you first got a digital camera, you had to put the floppy disk in. The battery, the quality of the picture was poor. The batteries were eaten up in like a day or less, after several times, and you had to change the battery. So the quality was so poor. So the chemical company said, they're not a threat to us. But now, over time, it's became a disruptive innovation, and I have it on my phone. Oops, I have better quality photos on my phone, So that's another example of a disruptive innovation. And then the last one I want to point out is CDs and DVDs versus downloaded digital media. Again, for those of you that are my age, if I told a 20-year-old today that when downloaded digital media first started, you had to open up a folder on your computer that was available to everybody in the whole world. And everybody in the whole world did the exact same thing. And we shared our files in these folders across all of our computers, across the entire world. And whatever you put in that folder, you shared with everybody. They would look at me like I was insane, kid today. They would say, what are you, nuts? But that was subpar technology. But it got better over time. And we didn't have to do that. Now we have streaming and things like that. So today I could walk into Walmart and there'll be a 4-foot by 4-foot box of DVDs and CDs that I could buy for like $1 each. So you can see how it was a disruptive innovation. Did you have a question? Go ahead.
Thanks. An even better example would be Napster.
Yeah.
Right. Napster came from the bottom and disrupted everything. And the only way that they could adjust was for Apple to be the innovator, to say, okay, you can download a song now. And that way they kind of got rid of it. So
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Napster started with file sharing on a folder, which how many people in security would allow that, to the fact that now you could just stream it from iTunes. Right. That was a double disruptive innovation. Okay, so that's disruptive innovation. So my first question for everybody is, where do you see yourself on these arrows? And this is the standard law of diffusion of innovation. Sometimes you're an early adopter, and sometimes you're a lagger. Like, how many people joined Netflix when you had to, when the DVDs were mailed? Okay, see? And then how many people joined Netflix when Blockbuster went away? Okay? And it's the same thing with chemical. How many people right now are still buying chemical, photo, film? You kind of can. And then how many people still are buying DVDs and have a DVD collection? So sometimes my point is I want you to think, sometimes you're an early adopter and sometimes you're a lagger. It's okay. There's no real right answer there, but you got to think, which side of the arrow are you on, especially as I start going through the data's disruptive innovation. Okay. So now I want to talk about data's disruptive innovation. But before I talk about the disruptive innovation, I want to talk about the market leader. Okay, I want to talk about what is our current model that we have right now, and then watch the disruptive innovation come in. Okay. So our traditional skills model looks like this. We have the early career people, which are mostly technical with some conceptual. Then we have our middle managers, which is kind of equal technical and conceptual. And then we have our senior managers, which is less technical and mostly conceptual, right? This is pretty standard. This is what we have right now. So this is how it goes. This is an example. Our senior managers have a conceptual model of where to go. I have a vision of where to go. They would explain that path to the middle managers. The middle managers would turn to the early career people and say, how do we get this done? Then the early career people would describe that technical path back to the middle managers, because they're both, remember, they're technical and conceptual. And then the middle managers would convert that into like a return on an investment or whatever budget, whatever the senior managers needed for the senior managers to give the go, no go on whether or not that conceptual path made sense, right? What I'm describing visually, because I'm a visual person, so I throw a lot of visual stuff in here. So visually what that looks like is this. It's called a hierarchical organization. You have your senior managers, middle managers, and early career, okay? Does this look familiar? Are people's organizations structured like this? Mine is. Okay, getting a lot of head nods, so that's great. Any questions online, by the way? If there are, just let me know.
There are a couple of comments.
Comments?
Yes, Paul said he made the comment that electric vehicles and combustion engine is a good example.
That's an excellent example.
And then Ali said that speaking from the perspective of working libraries, we seem to be on the left side of the arrow far too often. And Paul said, Ali, I think we all start on the left side.
Yeah. That is good. So, great, thank you very much. So that's where we are right now, right? Now I want us to talk about the new model, the disruptive innovation, that red line that's going to come up, okay? So with the advent of careers like data science, and with our building of mature and trustworthy AI tools, plus the advancements of cloud technology and our advancement in databases like unstructured databases, I think the data itself will provide a better path and will become a disruptive innovation by the early career. And that's going to replace the traditional way of looking at things that I was just describing. I think the early career people are going to use AI, ML, cloud, unstructured databases to discover something. I don't know what that is, but they're going to discover something in the data that's going to tell a better path that we should go. But this is a disruptive innovation. So at the beginning, this path is not going to be crystal clear. It's going to be subpar because not all of our data is in the cloud. Not all of our metadata is in unstructured databases. Not all of our data is connected. Our AI tools right now are still immature. But what's going to happen is that they're going to take what they know right now and they're going to explain this technical path to the middle managers. And then the middle managers are going to convert that into a conceptual picture for the senior managers. And then the senior managers are going to correlate what the early career people started into the traditional ROI, return on investment, however that looks, budget, whatever, and give the go, no go. So you can see this in this example, it's flipped. Everything's flipped upside down because the data itself is going to provide a better path to the future. So as the early career people start to put the pieces together, because like I said, not everything is together, not all of our data we're still siloed. A lot of our data is still siloed. A lot of our data is not in the cloud. We don't have all of our metadata in unstructured databases. We don't have fully functional AI and ML tools. It's going to be subpar. So in the beginning, you're going to be like, I don't know about this. But over time, as more and more of our data gets connected, like we've just been discussing for the past couple of days here, and as more and more of our metadata gets put into unstructured databases, and we start building AI and ML tools on top of it, and as we start maturing those tools, their vision is going to get better and better and better. So it's going to look like this. Vision over time, we're going to have our middle managers, our senior managers, and then the early career people are going to be a disruptive innovation, and their vision of where to go is going to get better and better and better over time, and eventually will displace the traditional way of thinking. This is where we are right now, in my opinion, of course. And again, I want to reiterate, this is an 80-20. I'm not saying every single organization, I'm not saying every single early career person is going to go through this, but I think this is, 80%. I think this is going to be something that we need to watch out. So this is where we are. We are at the early stages, and their vision is going to be subpar, but it will be better over time. So here's my next question now. Have you seen this yet? Now that I just pointed this out, have you seen this yet within your organization? Go ahead, Chris.
So one of the things that I've seen is that the early career people just get burned out. If you have to fight security and system administrators who are limiting what you can do, I could do everything that I needed to do in the cloud, but I'm being held back by other folks, and you get burned out and go away. How do you get past that so the middle managers and upper management respect that new innovative thinking?
Okay, so full disclosure, I did not ask him to say that question, okay? Because that is the next 5 or 6 slides, okay? I actually have slides that discuss how we can support disruptive innovation, data's disruptive. I have slides on that. So rather than just telling you the answer, we'll go through my slides, but that's a great question. Thank you for thinking ahead. Go ahead.
The question I have, Dave, that I've seen is for career advancement, oftentimes the traditional path is you have to start managing a team in order to take the next step, and that there isn't always a technical path to advancement for someone who really wants to stay technical, but it's like, oh God, help me, don't make me do budgets, right? And so I think to enable that, we have to think about that technical career path advancement that maybe looks a little bit different than what today's senior management, what their path was.
Yep. Did you have a question? No? Oh, I already. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, for most of my career, I've mostly worked in a more traditional organization, but for the past year, I've worked at Palantir, which is more that startup culture and really focuses on enabling people when they come in. So people will come in, they'll be there 2 months, all of a sudden they'll be leading some large project. And, it's pretty, and they have to not have that hierarchical structure to do this. So this is the first time I've worked without a hierarchical structure. But I just gotta say, it's pretty amazing sometimes, and you think it happened. I mean, that's where you have like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. I mean, they didn't go through that path and change the world, but so I mean, it is very uncomfortable in some ways if you've always worked in that structure, for sure. But it's also if you kind of sit back and sometimes just see where someone's going to take something without, I guess, all the baggage we carry when we've kind of worked our way up. Sometimes, I mean, that's
called the mental map.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive.
Yep. I got 2 questions. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, my question sort of relates to, you have a whole bunch of these enabling technologies, but how do you cultivate consensus towards sort of, so that everybody's on the same page?
Okay, I have a slide on that.
Okay.
Thank you very much for asking that. Okay. I have a slide on that. Great question. Thank you for asking it. Means you're thinking ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Interesting session so far. This is Ken Casey from NOAA. A lot of what you've presented so far has me thinking a lot about what we're doing in the scaled agile framework within NOAA right now. And in particular, there's this concept that they talk about now about the dual operating system. And so, this, if you've been doing SAFE or Scaled Agile Framework for a while, it's a relatively newer introduction, and it's particularly designed to help government understand how to implement SAFE. But the dual operating system idea is that this traditional hierarchical org structure does have some strengths, and we also just can't throw it out. Right. It's just
completely agree.
But it does things like stability, it does things like budget, it does things like regulatory stuff pretty well. But then you've got this whole agile, innovative side. And so I really like that. I used to think when I first saw it, I'm like, it's just a bunch of gobbledygook. But the more I thought about it, it's like, oh yeah, this is how we bring together both aspects of where we, who we are and where we want to go, and how do we bring in innovation and be disruptive, but do it in a way that allows us to meet our regulatory requirements.
I think, Ken, I think one of the things we think about from the government side, because I'm also with NOAA, I think one of the things we can do from the government side is that we have the hierarchical organization for administration, but then our development side, our non-administrative side, is more what I'm going to get to later, more flat, more like this. But yes, I agree with you, because especially when it comes to budget, there's some tough decisions that have to be made. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I'll get to that. I have a slide on that too.
Hey, so I'm also with NOAA. This is Ryan Berkheimer. But many years ago, I was with the Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy. And just to validate sort of this thesis a little bit, I have seen sort of this model work. We used to write permits for mines, and there's a lot of individuals that do that work on those. And we were able to combine our data using some tools. And like I heard, I think from Chris, the big blocker was a sysadmin, but we had our aider, the head IT person, who sort of allowed us to try this. We were able to consolidate all the permitting into, an application, in Python, which nobody had heard there before. And we took all these old permit writers, they worked usually on paper and Mylar maps, and we're able to, turn this permitting process into a very streamlined thing. And the coolest thing was going into a meeting with a big mining company, a consulting company, and just pulling up this permitting software and just showing them, no, you guys are predicted to pollute this much. And they were blown away. They'd never seen that analysis before. So I do have seen it. It's possible.
Great. Thanks. Rob? And then we'll see if anybody has anything online.
Yeah, thanks. This is a non-disruptive, supportive comment. I think whenever we've seen major technological breakthroughs, we've probably seen something like this. And there's, things that survive and do well, or organizations survive and do well, are parts of those organizations. Where you have that crossover, where you have the curves crossing here.
Yep.
I think there's probably a slope change in all three of the roles. Because while you can be early career and have a tremendous vision, you probably get a bit capped in terms of your ability to get that infused throughout the organization. But it's those, I think it's those key persons in the management structure that always are looking to identify you have to have multiple personalities, right? They've got to get things into operations and follow all the rules and everything, but they also at the same time, when you see this happen, will create incubation and exploration places. And I think that's where you see then, these curves take different slopes towards the future, or they burn out like Kodak.
Exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, supportive.
Thank you. Yeah, my goal is to get everybody aware of this so we don't become Blockbuster. And that's actually, I just gave you my conclusion, but. Any questions online? Okay. Let's go on. So now I want to talk about some of the results. Now that I showed you the data disruptive innovation, I want to show you some results of the data disruptive innovation. And the first one I want to show you is what I'm calling a power shift. So there's lots of different powers that people have for motivating people to do their work, okay? Obvious ones are the power to reward, like bonuses, and then the power to discipline. You're fired, okay? But those are pretty standard, straightforward. So I'm going to take those out of the picture, especially in the federal government, because a federal employee cannot get fired, they cannot receive bonuses, and they can't get promoted. So all those powers go away. But besides that, especially in the private sector, those exist, but they're not affected. So I'm going to take those out of the equations. And what I want to look at right now is what's called information power. Information is a form of power, okay? It's a motivating power. But over time, through this disruptive innovation, the rest of the organization are going to realize that the early career people are the ones that are accumulating and doling out the information, and that's going to lead to a power shift. Because remember, earlier, it was the conceptual vision was one form of power, one form of information. But now that's going to switch to the early career people, because people are going to be like, looking at the senior managers saying, I don't know if I like that direction. And they're going to look at the early career people and say, well, I like that direction. And so that's an information power shift. So as the information power shifts, the ability to make good decisions becomes out of balance. So what I want to do now is I want to use abstract math. And again, I have a link in the notes to show you how I got there. But I'm going to just take the end results of this TED Talk. And I'm going to show you 3 different powers that will be out of balance. Information, title, and decision. Title is, sovereign power, power by rank. I'm a director, I'm a deputy director, I'm a chief, you have a title. That's a sovereign power, that's a legitimate power. And then the power to make decisions. And, there's 2 forms of that power. One is you have the authority to make decisions. But the second one is you're able to make decisions. How many of us have been in a meeting where you're like, just make a decision, come on, please. So even if they have the authority to make decisions, they have to be able to make decisions. So that's 2 pieces of that puzzle, because we all know people that just, a good decision made on time is better than the best decision made too late. And some people just do not understand that concept. So let's look at abstract math to describe these powers, okay? There are people with all 3. They have title, information, decision. Then we could break that out into 3 other groups where they have 2 of the 3. They have either title information, title decision, or information decision. Then we could break that down into people that have 1 of the 3, title, information, and decision. And then of course, which you can't see at the bottom, it says none. Where people have none of the 3. And this 3-dimensional box is what I'm showing you, but what's really powerful is if I add the adjectives back in. So there are people, for example, that have title and information, but they don't make decisions. Or they had the title, they're allowed to make decisions, but they don't have the information, and so on. And what I'm trying to say here is that as that information power shifts to early career, most early career people in that hierarchical organization do not have a title, and they're not allowed to make decisions, but they have the information. So that makes this box even more relevant because it's now even more out of balance. And that's something that we need to correct. So my next question is, now that I showed you this, where are you on this box? And you don't have to answer if you don't want to. This is just philosophical in your head. Think about it. Where are you on this box? Do you have all 3? Are you in the 2 of the 3? Are you in the 1 of the 3? Are you at the bottom? So this is something that you need to think about. Where are you on this box so that we can correct it, so that we can fix it, so that we can make good decisions. Any questions? No. But before I go into how we can support, before I go into how we can support data's disruptive innovation, there's some considerations that we need to take into account, okay? The first is the accelerated pace of change. Not only is the pace of change accelerating, but the acceptance of that change is also accelerating. So for example, on this slide, you could see television. The amount of time it took to have television in most of the households was far longer than the amount of time it took for cell phones or even smartphones to be in all the households. So not only is the pace of change accelerating, but the acceptance of that pace of change is accelerating. So when you hear the old saying that the government's always 10 years behind, well, as time goes, that 10 years gets worse and worse because more and more change is occurring and the acceptance of that change is occurring. So eventually that 10 years, in theory, is actually longer. It may only be 10 years, but more change has occurred and the acceptance of that change has occurred. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to use my organization, okay? In my organization, we're finally adopting DevOps and DevSecOps. It was a tough, a little bit of a battle, but we're getting there. We're moving to more towards DevOps and DevSecOps. As Ken mentioned earlier, we're now adopting SAFe, things like that. So we're moving there. While we're adopting DevOps and DevSecOps, the rest of the world has moved on to DataOps and MLOps. My organization, we can't even think about doing DataOps. We don't even have the infrastructure to support DataOps or MLOps. But this is the way that the rest of the world is now just starting to adopt. So while we're adopting something that they have already moved on from, that change is accepting, that change is affecting how we perceive things. That makes sense? So this is something that we need to take into consideration, okay? The acceleration of the pace of change. And again, I have links in the notes that describe all this. The second thing that we need to take into consideration is called Chesterton's fence principle, or second order thinking. So what Chesterton's fence says is, you're walking in the woods and you see this really old, dilapidated fence in the woods. And you're like, we don't need that fence, let's take it down. Let's build over it. Let's build around it. Let's get rid of it. But what Chesterton's fence principle says is, why is that fence there? This is what's called second order thinking. The first order thinking is, we don't need it, attack. Second order thinking is, wait a minute, stop, take a step back. Why is that fence there? Is there a legal reason why that fence is there? Is there a political reason why that fence is there? Is there a mean old man with a shotgun and a dog? I don't know. We need to figure out why that fence is there before we take it down. And that's where the inexperience of the early career people really needs the institutional knowledge that the senior managers have. And so in that disruptive innovation, even though the early career people will have a better path, there's Chesterton's fence principle that's going to come into play, and they're going to be like, some institutional knowledge is needed here for guidance, which is really important. I call it, with my team, I used to call it the shiny object syndrome. They were like, whoa, look at this really cool thing. I'm like, hold on, we're not there yet. Like if my team said to me, let's do ML ops, I'm like, we don't have the data all in a data lake to do ML ops. That's my point. So that's the second order thinking. That's Chesterton's fence principle. Something that needs to be taken into consideration during this data disruptive innovation and also the pace of change. Does that make sense? I'm getting a lot of head nods, so that's good. So here's my next question. Does this occur in your organization? Do you see Chesterton's fence principle? Or did you see a violation of it and then you were like, now we got twice as much work to do because we didn't think about why that was there? Any questions on that? Any examples? All right, nothing online? Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering if it's the same or different. Like in your example, like, oh, we can't do ML ops because we don't have this infrastructure yet, right? Versus, like, it seems like in a way, like, well, that's just having that infrastructure is just like, it's sort of a roadblock. It's like it's a thing that makes it harder to move forward, but not necessarily like a good reason not to move forward. Versus like, oh, we can't do ML ops because there's like this philosophical or ethical thing we haven't taken into consideration, right? Like it seems like a difficulty in doing versus a reason not to do is maybe different.
Well, it could also be both, because what happens if the senior managers are like, I'm sorry, but our budget is going to go towards something else rather than building up the infrastructure to support that. So yes, but you're 100% correct, and that's why we need that other consideration to figure that out.
Yeah, I think another fence thing, I can't remember the name of the exact study, but there's like this area in Europe, like where during the Cold War there was an electrical fence and the deer all kind of learned not to cross it. And that went down over generations of deer. So the electrical fence is now gone, but deer in this forest area, they don't cross this space, but there's no reason to anymore.
Right.
And sometimes I think with the institutional knowledge, there's a way we've always done something that was for a reason, but sometimes if you don't challenge it, you get stuck into that rut.
So thank you very much, because I want to emphasize that, okay? If you say, why is this fence here? And they say, well, it's what we've always done, then take it down. Absolutely take it down. But if they say, yeah, there's statute, CFR 29 dot something, then you're like, okay, now I understand. But you're 100% correct. If the reason why that fence is there is because it's always been there and everybody's remembered that it's there, yeah, take it down. And take down that dilapidated fence and put up one of those electric, invisible fences. Everybody will just wear a collar or something, I don't know. All right, so any other questions then? All right. Anything online? Okay. So now I want to talk about how we can support data's disruptive innovation, okay? And this gets to some of the questions that was asked earlier, where I said I have slides to discuss it. And I'm going to do this from a tapered approach, meaning I'm going to start at the top, big and wide, at the organizational level, which should take a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of time, and I'm going to end at the individual, what we can do during lunch today, okay? So I want to end on a note of what we could do today, but plant the seeds of what we can do from an organizational point of view at the top, okay? So you see these starlings that are murmuring? Oh, and of course it freezes, there it goes. Okay, you see these starlings that are murmuring? Do you think there's one starling that is in charge, that is telling 10 other starlings what direction to turn, and then those 10 tell 30 others which way to go? No, that would be incredibly inefficient. The starlings do not have a hierarchical organization. You need to put people next to each other that are making the decisions. Now, for the first time in my entire presentation, and the only time in my entire presentation, I have taken out of the notes and put on the slides 2 talks. If you watch these 2 talks, you will completely understand how and why we need to change the organization. They do a much, much better job at describing it than I can possibly do it. But they do a very, very good job. That's why Ted invited them to do it, and that's why Martin works for Boston Consulting Group, a really good firm. So I just want to show you the murmuring as an example, and that we need to put the people next to each other. And by doing that, you can create more informal structured organizations rather than a hierarchical organization. And there's several different types. There's relational, cultural, network. I don't know which is the best for your particular organization, but there are other organizations out there other than a hierarchical organization that could possibly work. My one recommendation is do not try to do this on your own, because there's politics that will come into play. Bring in an outside consultant who's free of that politics, that can actually help you take a serious look at the organization and help you decide which is the best organization to change to. It depends on which one makes the most sense. But in these organizations, power is more evenly distributed because the organization is flattened and is less structured. And there's lots of studies that show more unstructured organizations create more innovation. Because when you're structured, there's less innovation. Because when it's unstructured, you have to figure things out. and that figuring things out sparks innovation. I have, in the notes, I have some references to it. So I don't know which is best for any particular organization, but there are others. Go ahead. And then Ryan has a question too.
One thing, you know, I just want to share, and I'd like your thoughts on it from my observation in working in an unstructured organization where there isn't a hierarchy, but what you do have is more invisible spheres of influence, because there's always has to be certain people who can, you know, deploy the budget and stuff like that. And I wonder, you know, I wonder if there's an aspect of that that presents challenges for equity and inclusion and accessibility for, you know, all types of differences with, you know, where, because influence is based on relationships and kind of getting into a circle of trust. And so I feel like that's one of, overall, I think there's a lot of net positives, but I think that's one of the risks. And I think especially in a place like the government, it would be really important to kind of have a plan to, you know, to ensure that these circles of influence don't get closed off.
Correct. I 100% agree with you. I wanted to, yeah, I 100% agree with you. Thank you for bringing that up. Ryan, did you have a question?
So, Dave, you keep saying unstructured through this, and you know, I might argue with you that everything can be assigned a structure.
Yeah, that is correct.
Right. So, when you
let's say less structured. Can we say less structured?
Yeah, but I would like to qualify that, or at least probe your mind and thoughts a little bit about that. So, if we're flattening and we're creating these, you know, highly connected, ad hoc, you know, networks. Are you arguing more than for stronger contextual identity for individuals so they can create these networks? Or, you know, how are these networks managed, right? You say the data, but I'm just kind of wondering, you know, how do those networks get formed on an ad hoc basis, break apart to accomplish something? And you might say the data, but, you know, I was just kind of hoping maybe for more on that.
Yeah, so there's, I get it a little bit into that in the next slide or two, but I'll admit that what I'm showing you now is especially in the government, it's like a 10-year plan. And there will be bumps, mistakes, we'd have to change, because you're right, that could, I did a whole paper on this. That could create what's called an LMX, leadership matrix exchange, where you get groups who are so high performing that they get all the good positions, all the good tasks, all the good jobs, all the good perks, and then the rest of the company starts looking at them like, why are you the A team? Why are you always getting this? And we're over here getting the you know, the bad stuff, and that could lead into dissent. It could lead into problems. It could end up busting up the entire organization. So yes, I completely agree with you. I personally speaking it would require lots of training, lots of experimentation. It would be a tough change to go from hierarchical to one of these. That's why the startups do it much better, because they start out like this. But yes, I completely, I understand your caution and your warning, and I agree with you that it could go down a bad path if we don't look at it.
For this, that what's going to happen is, you know, a stochastic model like this is just going to create we're going to let it create its own power structure.
Yeah, and I completely agree, and that's something that we have to watch out for. I think the Japanese, I mean, my personal favorite is the Kyotsu, which was created by Toyota in Japan. You know, I think that's a fantastic informal structure that we could look at. It's more closely aligned to this network structure, that the third bullet. but they take it to the next step. And I think that would actually help us out. But again, I don't know what would be best for each organization, and we'd have to. Yeah. 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 There's caution, and I agree with you. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, so maybe the answer is a little bit more in trying to move away from this sort of either or kind of thinking, structured, not structured, to being able to more dynamically reconfigure ourselves as needed.
Yes.
So, because we do rely on structure for a lot of things. It's particularly in government where we have a lot of rules that are externally applied, but we need to be able to adjust that structure as needed, not necessarily operate without a structure or some informal network that kind of emerges organically, but as needed, reconfigure ourselves, then use that structure for a while, and as the challenges morph, reconfigure ourselves again.
So you must have seen Martin's talk that I have listed, shown on this, because that's exactly what Martin discusses in his TED Talk. It's by far one of them. Martin? Yeah. You don't become a director at BCG for not being smart. Any other questions? No? Okay. Anything online? Let me know if there's something online. I'll move on to the next one. So now let's drop down a layer. Anything online? Okay. So now let's drop down a layer. We went at the organizational. Now let's drop down, and this is the entrepreneurship. Oh, there's a question. Go ahead.
Allie, you could go ahead and unmute and speak if you like.
Okay, yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I just wanted to make a note on, so as I said in the chat, I'm in a library and in a university rather than a government organization, but I think a lot of the same principles apply. One thing I would note, and I'm more to the early career side, although I'm getting dangerously close to that early to mid transition, which is kind of treacherous. One thing I was going to note is to go back to your earlier idea about people who'd like to stay on the technical side, not really having a path to advancement. That's one serious problem. I think another serious problem is, especially outside of government, there are almost no opportunities for internal advancement at all. People basically have to leave the organization in order to get a promotion and then maybe come back. And that institutional knowledge gets lost a lot there, I think, at these transitions between early to middle and middle to senior. I don't necessarily have an answer for that, but I think that it would help to build some of these informal networks if there was more stability and more of a path within an organization where people actually have an incentive to stay and to build on something.
Yep, that's a great point. Thank you. Okay, so now let's drop it down a level. We went from the organization, which is big picture, maybe 10 years. Let's drop it down to supporting programs. And this is where I was talking about. This is an entrepreneurship program. This is a program that I created in NOAA. I didn't make it up. This absolutely exists. But it's a way of holistically supporting data's disruptive innovation throughout the entire organization. And what the entrepreneurship program is just a bunch of people that take risks to move things forward. Skunkworks is a classic example of an entrepreneurship program, okay? For those of you that know Skunkworks through the DoD, they invented like the U-2 spy plane. They didn't ask, go through the normal, they just did it. They just moved it forward. So now I'm going to give you two examples of the entrepreneurship program, one success and one failure. The failure is Steve Sasson, who invented the digital camera at Kodak. And the digital camera, they could not holistically support that innovation, and it ended up putting them out of business, okay? So that's an example of a failure. The next one is a success, where Spencer developed a Post-it note while at 3M. He wasn't necessarily looking for a weak glue that could go on paper, and be reused, but he found it, but they had the ability to holistically support him throughout the entire organization so that they could bring it to market, and then did very, very well for them. So if you have the program, great. It can help move data's disruptive innovation of that early career, the people through the organization so it doesn't end up destroying the organization. Or I shouldn't say destroying, because that's maybe a little too harsh, but it could have adverse effects. So this is a great program. It's very easy to set up, and it could work. Drop it down a layer. Let's talk about the teams, okay? We're in organization programs, now we're down to the teams. This is overlapping teams, and this is what you brought up, okay? So you have team A that is the size of 2 pizzas, and they are working on something. Then you have team B, which is working on something else. There's at least one person who's on team A who is also on team B. Then you have team C working on something else, and there's somebody on B who's also on C, and then D is somebody on C and A. So what this does is this creates a flattened organization, a flattened structure of horizontal communication. There's a lot more horizontal communication. So as A innovates and creates something, it instantly gets communicated horizontally to B, C, and D, because there's members on each team, and they're like, B says, I know how to take that innovation and move it forward and build upon it. So this is what gets to what you were saying, like, how do you get consensus? You get consensus through the innovation of the teams that are working on it. This creates less title leaders, and it creates more innovation leaders, because the innovation is what's driving the teams, because they now own that innovation. It doesn't come from above. It comes organically out of the teams, and they own it. So by having this feeling of ownership, they're more motivated to carry it through. So if you create this horizontal teams, you have flattened the communication. It doesn't have to go all the way up and then all the way back down, and then sometimes it gets lost. They all know what they're doing, and they can then move each idea forward. Go ahead, Ken.
Excuse me, I may be nitpicking a little bit here, but we have this scenario and it's created actual real problems. So like when we're trying to do a joint planning event and you're trying to have teams A, B, C, and D all sit down and figure out their plan forward, just look at your diagram. It makes it really clear. Like team A may have 2 of its people that need to go over to B and D, and now all of a sudden half your team's not even in the planning. So I think what you're saying I would agree with entirely conceptually, and maybe I'm just looking for an opportunity to challenge you a little bit.
That's fine.
but there's some real problems with this kind of model as well. I would just say that.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, in the back.
So I'm Cindy Parr, I'm from USDA, and I actually want to respond to you, Ken, because when I saw this slide, I said, what we've been doing at USDA and my part of USDA is actually not bad. So I've been frustrated because I have to take ownership. I've created a lot of different committees that all have data in the title, and nobody can figure out why we have so many, and they're all taking little parts of the problem, and there's a lot of overlap. And so I keep thinking, I've got to sort this out, because it's confusing and people don't know which committee is supposed to be doing what. So it's not that we're simultaneously brainstorming or working on the same problem. We have overlapping groups of people, and I'm realizing now, actually, that's been a strength. So I'm gonna turn this around, and I'm gonna take this back to USDA and say, I did this all on purpose, or, But I mean, I think I am seeing out of that structure is that we are seeing, after like 2 or 3 years of this, some of the groups are coming up with ownership over the ideas that they would not have come up with if I had top down said, you need to do this. Even though maybe I've been saying it in some of these groups and not others, but maybe it sounds familiar and they don't realize that I'm the one who's, anyway, it's working out to be a lot more organic, I think.
I think so too. I think organic way of setting this up, and that's what Martin discusses in his TED Talk that I referenced a couple of slides back. But again, Ken, I agree with you. This is not for everyone. Maybe the organization is not structured to allow something like this. There's lots of reasons. This is an 80-20. So I completely agree with you. If it doesn't work, then don't do it. I'm not saying everybody should do this. Go ahead, Steve.
It seems like an important part of this strategy then might be to limit the connectivity of individuals. Sort of to Ken's point that if a person is connected to too many groups, then you're essentially forming a hierarchy that can, and this actually goes back to what the person online said, if they leave, the whole structure falls apart.
Correct.
So.
Yep. In the back, Miranda. It's like I know everybody.
I guess this is Miranda from NCI for people online. One thought that I have about the problems that we've raised with overlapping teams is that I think that's still thinking of a way that we've always done teams we always have live, used to be in person, now it's a lot of virtual, which is nice sometimes. We always have live meetings where we are talking and planning stuff together, which is useful, but I think there's also value in taking what could be done in a meeting and doing it individually in maybe a shared document, shared planning. I think there's a lot of meetings that happen that really could be possibly more productive, especially if you're on different teams, if you just maybe individually went over a document that you're sharing with people, and maybe you can still all talk to each other if you need to, but it kind of removes the need to always be together in that way.
Okay. And then also back to if they can.
Yeah, and if I could just riff on what Miranda was just saying, I really think that's awesome because I love a lot of what's in here, like the horizontal communication. And I guess that's like, just like to echo that point, that there are other ways to achieve that as well. Not, not just necessarily sharing bodies across teams, but asynchronous documents that people can share.
Oh, maybe Slack?
Slack. Oh, yeah.
Which we're not allowed to use. Sorry, I get off my soapbox now. People push me on my soapbox all the time.
Nazila Muradi, also at NCI. We're having NCI happy hour here today. I really like this idea. I love the horizontal communication because information doesn't trickle down very often. But I honestly think the innovation and the ownership has to come from some sort of spark within. You can put teams together or groups together, but somebody has to start pushing forward and it still requires some leadership to get people to get motivated to actually do some of the work. And I agree, there are a lot of things that could be done with 3 things in Slack or 1 things in a Google group where you lay out for your team members what needs to be done. And I always like to now, within the SAFE or whatever, to give people a level of effort. This should only take you 15 minutes, so don't so that people start not taking things and making them harder, making them feel like they should be harder than they are. But I think I like this idea of overlapping teams because a lot of times there's not even communication happening between the teams.
So that's a good segue into my next slide, which is if you're thinking, some of you may be thinking like right now, after I just showed you all this, what happens to the middle managers? Because you're correct. If you flatten the organization, if you have overlapping teams, you have less middle managers. Like I said, you have more innovation and less title leaders. So what happens to the middle managers? But there's a very, very, very important role that I wanted to get out, and this kind of hints at what you're saying. When you form your teams, there's basically 4 roles that should be filled. One is the creator, and that's the person who has the ideas on how to move, on where to go. Then you have the advancer. They're the people that say, I know how to move that idea forward. And then you have the refiner, and they're the ones that are saying, well, let's make sure that that is reasonable. And then you have the executor, and those are the persons like, just give me the task and I'm gonna get the job done. Okay, this is how you should this is a way of forming teams. Well, this is where a lot of your middle managers are gonna end up. They're going to end up at the refiner because they have that institutional knowledge that we were talking about earlier in the consideration. They're going to be the ones that are like, hey, did you think about this? Did you think about this? Did you think about this? So there's an absolute role for a lot of, when you flatten it out, the organization, and you create these teams, there is absolutely a role that these middle managers are going to fill. And here's the best part. This, again, is another 80-20. Probably 80% of your middle managers will become refiners, but some of them never wanted, as we just heard earlier, some of these middle managers, they don't want to become middle managers. They really wanted to be the creator or the advancer or the executor. But then they were like, well, I got to get promoted, so now I'm a manager. Now they can go back, and some of them will fall into the other roles, but majority of them will become the refiners. But so there is a role for them. I just want to make sure that we're not firing these people, okay? Okay, most of these people do not want to deal with budget, and that's where those people come in, because that's not the fun part of working, okay? Now let's drop it down to a level to the individual. Okay, now I'm going to talk about what we can do. And this is data's finite and infinite game. I actually talked about this at another conference, but I'm going to bring it up here, okay? There's two different games. There's a finite data game, which is known players, agreed upon rules, a set time to the game's end, and the goal is to win. Baseball is an example of a finite game, okay? An infinite game is where you have expected and unexpected players. The rules are changeable, and the goal is to keep it going. Evolution is an example of an infinite game. Now let's bring it back to the data side. This meeting is a finite game. We know who's going to be here. We know who's going to talk when. We know how long they're going to talk for. And the goal is to dole out the information and have a conversation. ESIP is an infinite game. We don't know who's going to join ESIP. We don't know what we're going to do. We don't know how we're going to get there. We don't know where we're going to go, but we're going to go somewhere. You know, it's going to evolve in our direction. So this conference, this ESIP conference, is a finite game within ESIP's infinite game. In my organization, in NOAA, the finite data game is I'm going to produce a weather alert within a certain period of time of reading the data, you know, reading taking the observations. You know, if I can give a tornado alert within 3 minutes of reading the data and it's an 8-minute warning, we won. Something like that. The infinite game is climate change. See, that's an infinite game. And a weather alert is a finite game. And how this relates to data disruptive innovation is that both are valid. Just recognize which game you're playing and form the teams accordingly. Because when you have a finite player against a finite player, you're in balance. Infinite player versus an infinite player, you're in balance. It's when you have a finite player versus an infinite player that you're out of balance. There's plenty of times you've been in a meeting where somebody's like, you know, maybe we should try this shiny object. And they're like, no, because we're doing operations, you know. We can't experiment in operations. You know, that's when you're out of balance. It's where the team is out of balance and you're in quagmire. Out of the infinite game is going to come some R2O, research operations, that's going to create a better finite game. And that's going to be from the data's disruptive innovation. Data's disruptive innovation in the infinite game is going to produce a better, more efficient finite game. This is where it comes down to the individual. Which game are you playing? Now that I just introduced you to this concept, or you watch Simon Sinek's talk, you should say to yourself, which game am I playing? Which team am I on? Am I formed accordingly? Am I tasked accordingly? This is something that we can do, you could do during lunch today, is think about this and say, is this right? Go ahead, you have a question?
Isn't the answer just, like, according to your previous argument, doesn't everybody have to be playing?
Okay, so I'm glad that it's almost as if, so let me answer your question by describing your question as well. Remember when I showed you overlapping teams? If one team is playing the finite game and another team is playing an infinite game and you have an overlap of person, that's fine. But when the person is on the finite team, they need to be thinking finite. When a person's on the infinite team, they need to be thinking infinite. It's when they cross over their thoughts, that's when you have problems. There's nothing wrong with the person, because I think all of us could do it. We're pretty smart. All of us could think both finite and infinite. It's just know when to think infinite and know when to think finite. That's why I'm at the bottom. I wanted to end with this so that you could think about it during lunch today and say, maybe I should be on another team, or maybe I should task my team differently. All right. I want to give now an example of data's disruptive innovation, okay? The example I'm going to give was made famous by Hollywood, but it is a true story. But the reason why I picked it is because it's a movie, and I expected, oh, well, I don't expect, I hope that everybody has seen this movie. As a matter of fact, out of really strange coincidence, it was on last night and I watched it. So that was, I was like, ooh, somebody was telling me something. Okay, so let's talk about the movie Moneyball, okay? For those of you seen it with Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill. All right. Traditional scouting in this movie, this traditional scouting was replaced by data-driven decisions. The data itself told a better story than the traditional way of thinking. When Pete, that's one of the main characters, when Pete was over at the Cleveland Indians, it was a hierarchical organization. Remember in the room when they were making the trade, Pete had to tell his boss what he thought, his boss had to tell his boss what he thought, and then they said no to the trade. The trade changed. Pete had to tell his boss what he thought, his boss had to tell his boss what he thought, and then the trade didn't happen. If Pete was not in that room, or if his boss did not listen to Pete, the trade would have happened, which would have gone against what the data was saying to do. What happened when when Pete went over to the Oakland A's, is that Billy Beane immediately flattened the organization and says, you're sitting next to me, and you're gonna help me make decisions. He didn't say, we're gonna keep the hierarchical organization. No, he immediately flattened it, and he says, you're sitting next to me. When Pete was at the Cleveland Indians, he had one power, the information. He was not allowed to make a decision, and he didn't have a title. He was like some junior analyst, something way down at the bottom. What happened when he went over to the Oakland A's? Billy B knew, because they were so used to the hierarchical organization, he had to give him a title. So he said he's now deputy, whatever, he gave him a hierarchical power, I forgot what it was. And he gave him the ability to make decisions, and he had the information. And a great example is the Eckerton scene on the last day of trading, when they were like, we'll trade you for, and then Pete's looking, goes Eckerton, and he goes Eckerton. And then Billy Beane goes Eckerton. Billy Beane didn't say to him, well, did you discuss this with your manager? Did you form a committee and, spend 6 months discussing it? And let me see your results and, all that. No, none of that happened. He immediately flattened the organization. He gave him the power to make decisions, and he trusted him, and he said, go. Billy Beane was an entrepreneur in this case, in this example. So it's a great example. And then for those of you that want to argue that Moneyball has changed, I agree with you. It started out, according to the movie, and it's slightly changed, but it's still in effect. And it did lift the curse of the Bambino. For those of you that live in Boston, should be very, very thankful for that. Okay. Any questions online? All right. So now I want to discuss my conclusion. So, if we recognize data's disruptive innovation, which I hope I just did, if we show support for it, and we plan accordingly with those considerations that I mentioned earlier, we can avoid becoming Blockbuster and actually be functioning within normal parameters. That was another data joke. That's what data used to say all the time. So here's my question. What can we do today? What can we do tomorrow? What can we do next year? What can we do in 5 years? See, it's that reverse tapered. Thanks. So we have what, like 15 minutes? All right, so we can either do Q&A or we can do a real life scenario, which is the next slide. Go ahead. Go ahead. We could start with Q&A, and if we get to the real life scenario, we can get to the real life scenario.
So I'm not sure how well articulated this will be, but I'll try. One of the things we've kept coming back to is, and you said it's easy for the startups to do this because they're starting from scratch. They don't have the burden of previous investment and institutional knowledge and tradition. So who's in trying to do this type of transition? Who's the appropriate people to mitigate that burden of saying, we have this. We're trying to depart from the structure, but we can't just blow it all up and run away. So is that the early career? Or how do those three levels of team play into that?
I think it's going to be a combination of allowing the early career people to create that vision, supporting them, giving them what they need, like data lakes and APIs and rich metadata and all that stuff like that. But it's also going to take both the entrepreneurs to help sell it. And that's why that entrepreneurship program really does need to be mixed of early career, middle career, and senior managers in that program, of people who really are on a cutting edge thinking of how to move things forward and not constantly say, this is what we always do. The ability to get into the entrepreneurship program should be well vetted. And if a person has a reputation of always denying innovation, they probably should not be in the entrepreneurship program. But I think the entrepreneurship program could really help out a lot. When it comes to the government, that's a tough battle. It really is a tough battle. You really need to find really innovative people within the organization that are willing to listen. Let me rephrase that, because there's a difference between listening and being heard. And so you need to find the people that are willing to hear what you have to say, and then have the ability to carry that forward. And that's going to take some time. It's going to take some effort to figure that out. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? Go ahead. I hope I answered your question earlier. Okay, good.
I gather you work for NOAA, right?
Mm-hmm, that's correct.
So how receptive is NOAA to sort of the concept of what you're trying to, the entrepreneurship itself? I mean, how open are they to sort of furthering that kind of a thing?
Can I plead the fifth on that? So here's what I'm going to say. NOAA's mental map, meaning what they've done. Okay, I'm going to say it. Oh man, people pushing me on my soapbox. NOAA's business model was created in 1970 by Richard Nixon. It does not work. It does not work. It worked in the 90s, 80s, and 70s before the advent of these computers. It does not work today. And it absolutely needs to change. Unfortunately, that's an act of Congress. I mean, literally, you have to get Congress to approve that. But there's nothing stopping us from figuring out what we should ask Congress to change to. If we wait on Congress, again, NOAA itself should be, the data should tell us, and we should be the disruptive innovation to Congress. And we should be the ones that are saying, hey, Congress, this is what we need to change to, rather than Congress saying, this is what we want you to change to. Does that make sense? But we had an innovator that was appointed by the last administration, but unfortunately, he's no longer with us. Not that he died. The administration changed. The administration changed, and he's no longer running NOAA. But he started us off down the right path, and he created these programs that I think are the way NOAA should look. It was a double-edged sword that last election, because he really had the vision and he put us in the right path. I just hope we can continue moving it forward. There's a group of us that are trying to move it forward, and we're the entrepreneurs. We haven't officially become the program, they haven't joined the program, but we have our own meetings, and we're trying really, really, really hard to move NOAA forward down this direction. Yeah. Oh, wow, there's a lot of questions. Good. Okay, we don't have to get to the scenario.
Well, I'm just interested on your thoughts on how we can do this in a virtual world. The collaboration between the teams works really well. If I could walk over to your office and start talking to you and establish that relationship, now it's not as easy to establish that relationship. I like the in-person ESET meetings because you get to talk outside of these meetings and get that relationship. And even if it's not blessed by management, you can have that cross collaboration without management's doing it organically amongst the early career people.
Unless they deny their ability to easily communicate.
Yeah, and some managers do that. They don't want you talking to other teams. Correct. Their initial reaction is, I want to protect my team, and if somebody else finds this person's good, they're going to come and snag them, and they're higher in the chain, so they can come and snag it, and there's nothing I can do. And if you know the people that you're managing on your team, and that's not a good fit for them, they don't want to be pushed up into
the team should last as long until the task is done, and then the team should dissolve, and then a new team should form around a new task and bring the people in that make sense to be on that task, rather than, because they're my people, they're going to do every task that I assign them, even if they can't do it. Yeah, yes.
But it takes a cultural change. How can we develop that collaboration culture in the virtual world?
Well, I think there are definitely tools that are out there that help. But you're correct. I think more. Now we're going down into travel budget and all that stuff like that, and team building. I don't think we do enough team building exercises, but yes, it is something that we're gonna have to overcome. But the younger people, maybe, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't have a great answer for you, so sorry, but it is a good question. I think we should adopt a technology that is being asked. I'll leave it at that. So if the team wants something, we should look at seriously getting it for them, because that will help, because they're asking for it. It's a bottom up rather than a top down, but I'm seeing top down right now. Go ahead, Ryan.
So my question, this one is about boundary condition for this. So when you talk about we, who is we? And I'm a definitions guy. Who defines the we?
The we in what sentence?
We want to enable this structure towards. Is it the mission? Is it, where does it? Is it a team level? But to what end, right?
I think it's all levels, and based upon what is being asked, I think the we is like the teams. The we can change based upon who is being asked. So, for example, the we, oh my God, how do I say this without getting myself in trouble? The we could be an entire location that is being asked not to conform to another location's way of doing business, because the culture is so different.
I guess it's maybe more like, so are you thinking of this as a way to data's disruptive innovation to an organization that exists based on some defined mission already? Or I'm wondering, is this something like, what is driving What is data disrupting? I guess is my question.
Okay, so that's a great question. And to be honest with you, here's the answer. I don't know, because the data will tell you that. And I don't know what that's going to be. And it could be something really, 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 really small, or it could be Blockbuster. I hope it's not. I really hope it's not. I really don't want to see NOAA become irrelevant. But it has the potential to go that large. Or it could be just within your own team, or your own organization, or your own division. That's a great question. And you know what? That'll be my next talk. Yeah, yes, I thought of that in your talk as well. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Well, I was about to say it. I just hope that we can define that boundary before it's too late. Yeah, I completely agree with you. Somebody else said it? Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to add a thought to the, the how do we do this and how do we grow these teams in a virtual environment? And just throw out kind of the flip side to, it is really lovely to get to work in person and go down the hall. But also, I think the kind of COVID virtual world way of thinking has also sort of blown up, like who can be on a team.
Yep.
Like I'm here as part of a detail working with the NCAI guys, and we do
Yep.
meetings between Hawaii, Colorado,
Right.
and North Carolina. And it's great. Like these are people I never would have gotten to work with before. It's way better to have a beer with them here at
Exactly.
EGIP now that we're in person. But I think since working remote has become the norm during COVID, I've done a lot more reaching out to like
Yep.
colleagues at like the Alaska Science Center and other folks that, it may not have occurred to me to reach out to when we were walking across the hall.
So I completely agree. And that was going to be my scenario that I was going to have us walk through together. Like if we look at COVID and working from home, what is the data's disruptive innovation here? What is the Chesterton's fence? I was going to walk through everything because I personally think that the data is telling us we can work from home. But some of the senior managers who spent their entire career in the office is telling us to come back into work. And maybe there's a hybrid, I don't know. That's why I was saying, like, I was going to actually have us walk through this data's disruptive innovation. The data is saying one thing, but the traditional values, the traditional way of thinking is telling us something completely different. And I was actually going to walk us through that because that's exactly my point. So, but we didn't have time. We only had 3 minutes.
And just looking at who's the we from another angle, coming from someone
please.
who's worked with NOAA for 17 years, most of the time as a contractor working on site. A lot of people at NOAA working on mission systems and data projects are contractors. And oftentimes when a contractor sees an innovation, you're often boxed out from a discussion. And so I think there's a lot of innovation that goes out the door because people don't want to hear anything a contractor has to say about thinking about a way to do things differently. I mean, I have a little bit of, baggage on my shoulders, but
Well, you
no,
should
but
talk to
for
the person
real,
sitting next to you.
when you think about who's in the discussion for innovation, are you losing out? Or is there a way to hear the voice of many people who are actually the ones building the systems or working with the systems are not federal employees? But there's also, a lot of challenges and issues, but I think that has to be addressed with the percentage of people working at NOAA who aren't federal employees, whether they're coming from cooperative institutes or whether they're coming from
a good idea
commercial
doesn't mean it
contracts.
has to come from a Fed. Completely, yes, please, I completely agree. All right, are we at lunch? I think everybody's really hungry, right? Okay, go ahead. If anybody wants to go to lunch, then we'll.
Sorry,
I'll talk.
just a couple minutes. So COVID was the disruptor, right?
Right.
And then so now the question about the virtual and how do you leverage that? Well, that's the need for your next disruption.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
That's why I put this up there.
And the organizational piece, Moneyball was a great example because he was doing the data-driven, and the coach kept saying, "That's not how I'm."
That's right.
That was a person who, like you said, I've always done it one way.
Exactly.
But then you had the CEO of the other team that said, that's
Yeah.
the innovation I want.
Correct.
So those are the leaders
That's
that
right.
we need to have come in
Yeah.
to
He even
recognize.
said in the movie, the first person through the door usually gets bloody.
That's right.
And he was 100% correct.
Exactly.
Yes, and I didn't, my wife yelled at me when I said this, when I was practicing with her, but one of the downfalls of the entrepreneurship program is it could kill your career because you're taking risk to move things forward. And a lot of organizations don't look at what's called smart failures.
Right.
And they think of smart failure, which is okay, you know, it's not okay. It should be okay, but they're thinking it's not okay because I invested time and money into something that you tried to do, but it failed. And like, yeah, but we look what we learned from it. And we're not going to make that same mistake twice. And that's what an entrepreneur does. It takes risks.
Right.
And doesn't guarantee success.
That's where they lack the vision. If you look at John DeLorean, what he did with the GTO.
Yeah.
Right. And they didn't want that, but yet the GTO is one of the best-selling
Look
vehicles.
at the one that moved to Chrysler from Ford.
Lee Iacocca.
Lee Iacocca.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Yep.
Yeah, completely agree. Yeah. All right, let's go to lunch. Thanks, everybody online.